The morning light filtered through my apartment window like watercolor bleeding into paper, soft, diffused, painting everything in muted golds and grays. I'd grown accustomed to this particular quality of light, the way it crept across my hardwood floors at exactly 7:23 a.m., marking another day in a life that had become comfortable in its predictability. My routine was sacred in its simplicity. Coffee first, dark roast, 2 sugars, no cream, while I watched the city wake up through the narrow gap between buildings. Then work, hunched over my laptop at the small table by the window, designing websites for clients I'd never meet. Lunch was usually something microwaved, eaten while scrolling through news I'd forget by evening. Dinner, a book, sleep, repeat. I told myself I was content. At 28, I'd carved out a quiet existence that asked nothing of me beyond competence and punctuality. No drama, no complications, no one to disappoint or be disappointed by. The apartment complex on Maple Street suited me perfectly. Old enough to have character, new enough to have reliable plumbing, and populated mostly by other working professionals who valued privacy as much as I did. Which is why the moving truck parked outside on that Tuesday morning felt like an intrusion into the careful order I'd constructed. I watched from my window as 2 men in matching gray uniforms hauled boxes and furniture up the narrow staircase. Nothing particularly interesting. A couch, a bookshelf, the usual detritus of someone relocating their life. But then I saw him. He was directing the movers with quiet authority, pointing toward my floor, the third floor, with hands that moved economically, purposefully. Even from 3 stories up, I could see the line of his shoulders, the way he stood with one hip cocked slightly, patient but alert. Dark hair that caught the morning sun, tall, lean, wearing jeans and a gray Henley that looked soft from repeated washings. I told myself I was just curious about my new neighbor. The apartment across from mine, 3B to my 3A, had been empty for 2 months since Mrs. Chen moved to assisted living, but I found myself lingering at the window longer than necessary, watching as he disappeared into the building with the movers trailing behind him. The sound of footsteps in the hallway, muffled voices, the occasional thud of furniture being maneuvered through doorways, it all felt strangely intimate. Someone new was creating a home just 20 feet from where I slept each night. I tried to return to my work, but concentration eluded me. Every sound from across the hall drew my attention. The scrape of something heavy being dragged across the floor, a door closing. Voices growing fainter as the movers finished their job and left. Then silence. But it was a different kind of silence than I was used to. Before, the hallway held the hollow quiet of an empty space. Now it thrummed with potential, with the knowledge that someone else was there, settling into their own routines, unpacking their own life. By evening, I'd seen him twice more through the peephole in my door. The first time was around 3 o'clock. I'd heard his door open and close, followed by footsteps heading toward the elevator. Some impulse I couldn't quite name made me rise from my desk and cross to the door. The peephole gave me a fisheye view of the hallway, distorted but clear enough. He was walking away from me toward the elevators, and I had a moment to study the breadth of his shoulders, the easy way he moved. Dark jeans, a different shirt now, navy blue, sleeves pushed up to his elbows. There was something graceful about his gait, unhurried but purposeful. I should have looked away, should have returned to my work. Instead, I found myself holding my breath, waiting to see if he'd turn around. He didn't. The second time was just after 6 when I heard his door again. This time, when I looked through the peephole, he was coming toward my door from the elevator, carrying what looked like takeout bags. Chinese food from the white containers I could glimpse through the plastic. This time I got a full view of his face. He was younger than I'd initially thought, maybe 26, 27, strong jawline, dark eyes, the kind of mouth that looked serious in repose but probably transformed when he smiled. There was something both open and guarded about his expression, like someone who was naturally warm but had learned to be careful about showing it. As he approached his door, fishing keys from his pocket, he paused. For just a moment, his eyes flicked toward my apartment, not toward the door exactly, but in my direction, as if he could sense someone watching. as if he could feel my attention like heat through the walls. My heart did something stupid in my chest. A skip, a flutter, the kind of reaction I hadn't felt since college. I stepped back from the peephole so quickly I nearly stumbled, my face burning with embarrassment at being caught, even though he couldn't possibly have seen me. But the moment stayed with me through dinner, through the book I tried and failed to read, through the restless hour I spent lying in bed that night, staring at the ceiling and wondering what kind of person chose Chinese takeout for their first meal in a new home. The next morning brought rain, a steady gray downpour that drummed against my windows and made the apartment feel smaller, cozier. I made my coffee and settled at my usual spot by the window, laptop open, ready to lose myself in code and color palettes. But I found myself distracted by the sounds from across the hall. He was awake early, like me. I could hear the soft thud of footsteps, the distant rush of water through pipes. A shower running, then stopping, the mechanical hum of what might have been a coffee maker. We were living parallel morning routines, separated by 20 feet and a locked door. Around 9, I heard his door open. Without really deciding to, I found myself at the peephole again. He was dressed for work, dark slacks, a button-down shirt the color of pale blue sky, a messenger bag slung across his shoulder. His hair was still slightly damp from the shower, and there was something about seeing him in this moment of transition caught between the private space of home and the public world outside that felt almost unbearably intimate. He locked his door and headed toward the elevator, and I watched until he disappeared around the corner. The day passed slowly. I worked, but with less focus than usual. Every sound from the hallway made me look up, expecting to hear his return. When lunchtime came and went without any sign of him, I realized I was listening for someone I didn't even know, waiting for a person who was nothing to me but a stranger who happened to live across the hall. This was ridiculous. I was a grown man, not some teenager with a crush. I forced myself to concentrate on work, to ignore the empty feeling that had settled in my chest like hunger. But when I heard his key in the lock at 6:47 p.m., I was at the peephole before I could stop myself. He looked tired. There were lines around his eyes that hadn't been there that morning, and his shoulders had a slight slump that spoke of a long day. He fumbled with his keys for a moment, and I had the strangest urge to open my door, to ask if he was all right, to offer help I had no reason to give. Instead, I watched him disappear into his apartment and tried to ignore the way my chest tightened with something that might have been concern. That night, I ordered pizza. As I waited for delivery, I found myself wondering what he was having for dinner. Whether he was settling in okay, if he'd found the good coffee shop on the corner, or discovered that the radiator in the back bedroom made that clanking noise on cold nights. These were not normal thoughts for me. I'd lived in this building for 3 years without once wondering about my neighbor's dinner plans or radiator problems. But there was something about him. Maybe it was just the newness, the disruption to my routine, that had lodged itself in my awareness like a splinter I couldn't quite reach. The pizza arrived at 8:30, carried by a teenager who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. I tipped him and carried the box inside, the smell of cheese and oregano filling my small kitchen. As I opened the bus, I heard a door in the hallway. Not his door. I was learning the subtle differences in the sounds our respective doors made. This was someone else, maybe the woman from 3C heading out for her evening jog. But the sound made me think of him anyway. Made me wonder if he could smell the pizza through our shared walls, if it reminded him of late nights in college or Sunday dinners with family or some other life I knew nothing about. I ate standing at my kitchen counter, looking out the window at the rain-slicked street below. The building across the narrow alley had lit windows, little rectangles of warm light that offered glimpses into other people's lives. A woman reading in an armchair, a man washing dishes, a couple sharing a bottle of wine. All of them together, satié, all of them connected to someone else. The thought came unbidden and sat heavy in my stomach alongside the pizza. When had I become so alone? When had solitude stopped feeling like choice and started feeling like default? I was still pondering this when I heard it. A soft knock at my door. My heart jumped. Pizza places sometimes forgot items, came back with apologies and breadsticks. But when I looked through the peephole, the hallway was empty. I unlocked the door and peered out. Nothing. No one. But as I started to close the door, I saw it. A small white envelope on the floor just outside my threshold. My name was written on it in careful script, 3A. I picked up the envelope and looked around the hallway again, still empty. Whoever had left it was gone, vanished as quietly as they'd come. Back inside, I turned the envelope over in my hands. The paper was thick, expensive, the kind of stationery that suggested someone who took care with small gestures. Inside was a single sheet of paper with a brief note. "Welcome to the building. I hope the radiator in the back bedroom doesn't keep you awake. I learned that trick with the wrench from Mrs. Chen. If you need anything, I'm across the hall. 3A. I read it twice, then a third time. The handwriting was the same careful script as on the envelope, each letter formed with precision. But there was warmth in the words, a thoughtfulness that made something flutter in my chest. He'd noticed the radiator. He'd thought about my sleep, about my comfort. He'd taken the time to write a note, to walk across the hall, to leave it at my door like a small gift. I found myself smiling, actually smiling, for the first time in days. But then reality crept in. The note was signed 3A, my apartment number. He'd gotten confused, left his own note at his own door by mistake. The greeting was meant for him, not from him. The smile faded, of course. I was the new neighbor in this scenario, even though I'd been here for 3 years. He was being welcoming, and I was, what? Lurking behind my peephole, building fantasies about a stranger's kindness? I folded the note carefully and set it on my kitchen counter. Tomorrow, I'd return it, explain the mistake, maybe introduce myself properly. But that night, as I lay in bed listening to the rain, I found myself thinking about his handwriting. The way he'd dotted his I's, the slight slant to his letters, the care he'd taken with a simple welcome note for someone he didn't even know. If you need anything, I'm across the hall. The words echoed in the darkness, and for the first time in a long time, I fell asleep thinking about not being alone. The next morning dawned clear and bright, the rain having washed the world clean overnight. I woke earlier than usual, my internal clock disrupted by dreams I couldn't quite remember, but that left me feeling restless, anticipatory. Coffee first, as always. But as I waited for it to brew, I found myself looking at the note on my counter, thinking about the conversation I'd have to have with him. The explanation, the returned envelope, the awkward introduction that would reveal me as the neighbor who'd been watching him through the peephole. The thought made my stomach churn with embarrassment. I was still working up the courage when I heard his door open. 8:23 a.m., 17 minutes later than yesterday. Some part of me had been keeping track without realizing it. By the time I reached the peephole, he was already walking toward the elevator. Same messenger bag, different shirt. This one white with thin blue stripes. His hair was messier today, like he'd overslept and rushed through his morning routine. Something about that small imperfection made him seem more human, more approachable, less like the mysterious stranger I'd been building up in my mind and more like a regular person running late for work. The elevator doors closed behind him, and I was left alone with my coffee and my cowardice. I spent the morning trying to work, but my eyes kept drifting to the envelope. By noon, I'd composed and discarded half a dozen scenarios for returning it. Just slip it under his door with a brief explanation? Wait for him to come home and knock? Leave my own note explaining the mix-up? All of them felt wrong, loaded with potential for embarrassment. In the end, the decision was made for me. I was taking a break from work, standing in my kitchen and eating a sandwich when I heard voices in the hallway. One was his. I'd learned to recognize the low, warm timbre of it even through walls. The other was unfamiliar, older, with the practiced cheer of someone in customer service. "Should have the internet set up by tomorrow afternoon," the stranger was saying. "Any problems before then, just call the number on the card." "Thanks," came his reply. "I appreciate you getting it sorted so quickly." "No problem. Welcome to the building, by the way. I'm Jerry, been doing tech work here for about 5 years. You picked a good place. Quiet, good neighbors." That's what I was hoping for. There was something in the way he said it, a weariness that suggested he'd lived in places that weren't quiet, with neighbors who weren't good. The thought made me curious about his story, about what had brought him to this particular building on this particular street. You settling in okay? Jerry asked. Yeah, mostly. Still figuring out some things, like whether the guy in 3A ever actually leaves his apartment. My sandwich turned to cardboard in my mouth. Jerry laughed. Oh, that's Marcus. He works from home, does something with computers. Real quiet guy, keeps to himself mostly. But he's all right. Helped me carry my tools upstairs once when the elevator was broken. Marcus, he repeated, and something about the way he said my name made my skin prickle with awareness. Good to know. You two met yet? Not officially. There was a pause, and I found myself holding my breath, waiting for whatever came next. Well, Jerry said, I'm sure you will eventually. Small building, friendly faces. You need anything else from me? I think I'm good. Thanks again. Anytime. I heard Jerry's footsteps retreating toward the elevator, but I didn't hear his door close. For a long moment, there was just silence in the hallway. Then, so soft I almost missed it, I heard him say, Marcus. Like he was testing the name, seeing how it felt in his mouth. My face burned with embarrassment and something else, something warmer and more dangerous. He'd been asking about me, wondering about my habits, my schedule. The guy in 3A who never leaves his apartment. Was that how people saw me? As some kind of hermit hiding away from the world? The truth was uncomfortable. Maybe that's exactly what I'd become. That evening, I made a decision, not about the note that still sat on my counter, a small white accusation, but about myself, about the life I was living or maybe not living. I would go for a walk, nothing dramatic, just a trip around the block, maybe a stop at the coffee shop I'd been meaning to try for months. Normal things that normal people did on normal Tuesday evenings. I changed out of my work clothes, which embarrassingly were also my lounging clothes and my sleep clothes since I rarely left the apartment. I put on jeans that still fit well, a sweater that didn't have any stains, shoes that remembered what pavement felt like. In the mirror by my front door, I looked like someone who might leave his apartment occasionally, someone who might be worth having a conversation with. The hallway was empty when I stepped out, locking my door behind me. But as I walked toward the elevator, I could hear sounds from 3B, music playing softly, something classical that I couldn't identify. The sound of someone cooking, maybe, or just moving around their space, making it home. The elevator arrived with its familiar ding, and I stepped inside, pressing the button for the ground floor. As the door started to close, I heard a door open in the hallway, his door. For a split second, I considered hitting the door open button, waiting to see if he was heading out too, maybe sharing the ride down. But cowardice won, and I let the doors close, carrying me away from the possibility of an actual conversation. Outside, the evening air was crisp and clean, carrying the scent of autumn leaves and someone's dinner cooking. The coffee shop was only 2 blocks away, and I walked slowly, trying to remember what it felt like to be a person moving through the world instead of observing it from behind glass. The shop was warm and crowded, filled with the comfortable hum of conversation and the hiss of espresso machines. I ordered a latte and found a small table by the window, watching people pass on the sidewalk outside. A couple holding hands, a woman walking a small fluffy dog, a man talking animatedly into his phone, gesturing with his free hand. All of them connected to something, someone, all of them part of the world in a way I'd forgotten how to be. I was contemplating this when I saw him through the window. He was across the street, coming out of a small restaurant with a paper bag that probably contained dinner. He paused on the sidewalk, looking both ways before crossing, and in that moment of stillness, his eyes found mine through the coffee shop window. The recognition was instant and mutual. His steps slowed. I lifted my hand in what might have been a wave, though it felt more like an apology. He smiled. It was just a small smile, barely more than a softening around his eyes. But it hit me like a physical thing, warm and surprising and completely unexpected. He raised his own hand in return, then continued across the street and out of sight. I sat frozen at my table, latte cooling in my hands, heart doing acrobatics in my chest. He'd smiled at me specifically, not at some generic neighborly acknowledgement, but at Marcus from 3A, the guy who never leaves his apartment. There had been recognition in that smile and something else, something that might have been please surprise. The walk home passed in a blur. I was hyper-aware of every step, every breath, every beat of my heart. By the time I reached our building, I'd replayed the moment through the coffee shop window a dozen times, analyzing every detail, every possible meaning. In the elevator, I caught sight of myself in the polished steel doors. I looked different, more alive, maybe. Less like someone hiding from the world and more like someone who might be worth finding. The hallway was quiet when the doors opened, but I could see light under his door, could hear the faint sound of that same classical music. He was home, probably eating his dinner, maybe thinking about the brief encounter on the street. Or maybe not thinking about it at all. Maybe it had been nothing more than neighborly politeness, and I was reading far too much into a simple smile. I unlocked my door and stepped inside, but instead of immediately closing it behind me, I paused. The note was still on my kitchen counter, still waiting to be returned. Maybe this was the moment. While the memory of his smile was still fresh, while I still felt like someone who might be brave enough for a simple conversation. Before I could lose my nerve, I picked up the envelope and stepped back into the hallway. His door was 20 feet away, 20 feet in one knock. One brief conversation, one return note, one moment of normal human interaction. I was halfway there when his door opened. He stepped out, probably heading for the trash chute at the end of the hall, carrying a small bag in one hand. He was wearing jeans and a gray t-shirt, barefoot, his hair mussed like he'd been running his fingers through it. We stopped at the same moment, facing each other in the hallway with 10 feet of carpeted space between us. "Hi," he said, and his voice was exactly as warm as I'd imagined it would be. "Hi," I managed, suddenly aware that I was holding his note, that I looked like some kind of stalker who'd been waiting for him to emerge. "I saw you at the coffee shop," he continued, seemingly unbothered by the awkwardness of the moment. "Good choice. They make the best lattes on this side of town." "Yeah, it was good." Brilliant conversation, Marcus. Truly scintillating. He tilted his head slightly, studying me with those dark eyes I'd only seen through the peephole before. Up close, he was even more striking. Sharp cheekbones, a mouth that looked like it smiled easily, skin that held the remnant of a summer tan. "You're Marcus," he said. And again, something about hearing my name in his voice made my pulse quicken. "And you're—" "David." He shifted the trash bag to his other hand and took a step closer. "I've been meaning to introduce myself properly, just moved in across the hall." "I know, I heard the movers." I felt heat rising in my cheeks. "This is for you, actually. I think you left it at my door by mistake." I held out the envelope and he looked at it with confusion before understanding dawned on his face. "Oh," he said, and then he laughed, a rich, warm sound that seemed to fill the hallway. "No, that's not a mistake. That's for you. But it says 3A. That's my apartment." "I know." He was still smiling, and there was something almost fond in his expression now. "I wrote it to the person in 3A, which is you." I stared at him, trying to process this information. "But you're the new neighbor." "New to this apartment, yes. But I used to live here before. 3C, actually, about 2 years ago. I moved out when I got a job across town, but when this place came available," he shrugged. "I liked the building, liked the neighbors." The world tilted slightly. All this time I'd been thinking of him as a stranger when he'd been here before. He'd lived just down the hall, had probably passed me in the elevator, had maybe even noticed me in ways I'd been too self-absorbed to realize. "You remember me?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know the answer. "Of course I remember you." His voice was soft now, almost gentle. "Quiet guy who works from home. Always polite when we passed each other, but kept to yourself. I always wondered—" "Wondered what?" "If you were shy or just not interested in getting to know your neighbors." The honesty in his voice caught me off guard. There was no judgment in it, just curiosity and something that might have been hope. Shy, I admitted, feeling like I was confessing to a crime. Definitely shy. That's okay, he said, and took another step closer. We were only a few feet apart now, close enough that I could see the flecks of gold in his dark eyes, could catch the faint scent of his soap or shampoo. I can work with shy. The words hung in the air between us, loaded with possibility and promise. I felt my mouth go dry, my heart rate spike with something that was part attraction and part terror. I should let you. I gestured vaguely toward the trash bag in his hand. Right. But he didn't move, didn't step away. Instead, he looked down at the envelope still in my hands. You haven't opened it. I thought it was a mistake. It's not. He met my eyes again. Open it. With shaking fingers, I unfolded the note I'd read a dozen times already. But David reached out and gently turned the paper over. On the back, in that same careful script, were more words. P.S. I make excellent coffee, and I have a balcony with a view of the park. If you ever want to try something besides takeout and solitude, you know where to find me. I read it twice before the meaning sank in. This wasn't just neighborly politeness. This was, what? An invitation, a proposition, a gentle suggestion that maybe, possibly, I didn't have to be alone all the time. When I looked up, David was watching me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Patient, hopeful, maybe a little nervous. That's assuming, he said quietly, that you'd be interested in something like that. 1,000 responses crowded my throat. Yes, I wanted to say. Yes, I've been watching you through my peephole like a creep. Yes, I've been thinking about you since the moment I saw you direct those movers. Yes, I smile when I hear your footsteps in the hallway, and I listen for your door. And I've been lonelier than I realized until you moved back in and reminded me what it felt like to be curious about another person. Instead, I said, I'd like that. The smile that spread across his face was radiant, transforming his entire expression from guarded hope to open delight. Good, he said. That's really good. We stood there for a moment, grinning at each other like idiots, the air between us crackling with new possibility. I should really get rid of this trash, he said eventually, holding up the bag with a rueful expression. And I should probably eat something more substantial than coffee and pizza. Tomorrow? He asked. Maybe around 7? I'll make dinner, show you the balcony. I'd like that, I repeated, and meant it more than I'd meant anything in a long time. It's a date, then. The words slipped out casually, but I saw the moment he realized what he'd said, saw the brief flicker of panic in his eyes. I mean, if you want it to be. David. Yeah. It's a date. The relief that flooded his face was so profound it made my chest ache with tenderness. Whatever this was between us, whatever had been building through glances and notes and careful observation, it wasn't one-sided. He'd been hoping too, watching too, wondering what it would be like to bridge the gap between solitude and connection. Tomorrow, he said again, like he was making sure it was real. Tomorrow. He headed toward the trash chute, and I let myself back into my apartment, closing the door behind me and leaning against it like I'd just survived something momentous. In my hands, the note felt like a promise. On my face, I could feel the lingering ghost of a smile that didn't seem inclined to fade. Tomorrow, I would have dinner with David. Tomorrow, I would see his balcony, taste his coffee, maybe begin to understand what it meant to let someone else into the careful solitude I'd built around myself. Tonight, I would lie in bed and listen to the sounds from across the hall, footsteps, running water, the soft thud of furniture being moved, and know that tomorrow I wouldn't just be listening. Tomorrow, I would be invited in. The next day passed with excruciating slowness. I tried to work, but concentration was impossible. Every few minutes, I found myself looking at the clock, calculating how many hours until 7 p.m., wondering what I should wear, what I should say, whether I was reading too much into a simple dinner invitation. But then I'd remember the way he'd looked at me in the hallway, the warmth in his voice when he'd said, "It's a date," and my doubts would settle into something more like anticipation. Around 4 o'clock, I heard him come home. His key in the lock, footsteps across his floor, the sound of someone moving with purpose. Cooking sounds followed. Running water, the clink of dishes, something sizzling in what was probably a pan. He was making dinner. For me. The thought sent a warm flutter through my chest that had nothing to do with hunger and everything to do with being cared for, being thought of, being worth the effort of a home-cooked meal. At 6:30, I stood in front of my bathroom mirror, trying to decide if I looked presentable or like someone who'd spent too much time thinking about his appearance. I'd changed clothes 3 times, finally settling on dark jeans and a blue button-down shirt that I'd been told once brought out my eyes. My hair was hopeless. It always was. But at least it was clean and reasonably tamed. My face looked nervous, excited, like I was about to take a test I'd studied for but wasn't sure I'd pass. At exactly 7 o'clock, I knocked on his door. The sound of footsteps approaching, the click of a lock being turned, and then David was there smiling at me from his doorway like I was exactly who he'd been hoping to see. "Hi," he said, stepping back to let me in. "Hi." His apartment was a mirror image of mine in layout but completely different in feeling. Where mine was sparse, carefully organized, minimal, his was warm and lived in. Books everywhere, on shelves, stacked on tables, scattered across the couch like he'd been in the middle of reading 3 different things at once. Plants on every available surface, green and thriving in ways that suggested someone who actually remembered to water them. Art on the walls, not expensive pieces, but things that looked chosen for love rather than decoration. It felt like a home where someone actually lived rather than a place where someone merely existed. "This is nice," I said, meaning it. "Thanks. I'm still getting everything back where I want it, but it's starting to feel like home again." He gestured toward the kitchen where I could see something steaming on the stove. "I hope you like pasta and wine. I may have overestimated my cooking abilities and compensated with alcohol." "I like both." "Good." He looked relieved, like he'd been genuinely worried about my dietary preferences. "Come on, I'll show you the balcony." He led me through the living room to a set of French doors I hadn't noticed at first. They opened onto a small balcony that was barely big enough for 2 chairs and a tiny table, but the view was exactly what he'd promised. A perfect sightline to the park across the street, where the trees were just beginning to turn autumn colors. "This is why I wanted this specific apartment back," he said, settling into one of the chairs and gesturing for me to take the other. "The balcony in 3C faces the alley. This one faces life." I sat down beside him, our chairs close enough that our knees almost touched, and looked out at the view. The park was busy with evening activity, people walking dogs, joggers following the winding paths, a couple sharing a picnic on the grass. "It's beautiful," I said. "I used to sit out here in the mornings before work," David continued. "Just for 10 minutes watching people start their day, it made me feel connected, I guess. Like I was part of something bigger than just my own routine." I understood what he meant. From my own window, I watched the world too, but from a distance, like a spectator rather than a participant. This felt different, closer, more immediate. "What made you move back?" I asked. He was quiet for a moment, looking out at the park with an expression that had gone thoughtful and slightly sad. "The job across town didn't work out the way I'd hoped," he said eventually. "And the apartment there was lonely. Modern, efficient, everything I thought I wanted, but it never felt like home. I realized I'd been happier here, even in the smaller space." "Because of the balcony?" "Partly." He turned to look at me, and there was something in his eyes that made my breath catch. "But also because of the people, the sense of community, even if it was quiet community, even if we mostly just nodded to each other in the hallways." Something in his tone suggested there was more to the story, but before I could ask, he was standing up, brushing off his jeans with hands that seemed slightly nervous. "I should check on dinner," he said. "Make sure I'm not burning our first date meal." First date? The word sent a thrill through me that was part excitement, part terror. "Can I help with anything?" I asked, following him back inside. "Just keep me company. I cook better when I'm not alone with my thoughts." The kitchen was small like mine, but he'd made it feel welcoming with warm light and the kind of organized chaos that spoke of someone who actually enjoyed cooking. He moved around the space with easy familiarity, stirring something that smelled like garlic and herbs, checking on bread that was warming in the oven. "So," he said, not looking at me as he worked, "what do you do? I know Jerry said something about computers, but that covers a lot of territory." "Web design mostly, some app development. I work with small businesses, freelancers, people who need websites but don't have the budget for big agencies." "That sounds interesting. Do you like it?" I considered the question. It wasn't one people asked very often, and I wasn't sure I'd ever really thought about the answer. "I'm good at it," I said finally. "It's solitary work, which suits me. And I like the problem-solving aspect, taking someone's vision and figuring out how to make it work technically." "But do you like it?" he pressed, glancing at me with curious eyes. The question hung in the air between us, more complex than it seemed. I found myself thinking about mornings spent alone at my computer, the satisfaction of clean code, the isolation that had once felt like freedom but now seemed more like hiding. "I thought I did," I said slowly. "But lately, I've been wondering if I chose it because I enjoyed it, or because it let me avoid things I was afraid of." He turned from the stove to look at me fully, and there was something in his expression that made me feel both exposed and understood. "Like what?" "Like this," I said, gesturing between us. "Like conversations with people I might actually care about." The words came out more honest than I'd intended, raw in a way that made me want to take them back. But David just nodded like he understood exactly what I meant. "I know that feeling," he said quietly. "It's easier to be alone than to risk being disappointed, or disappointing someone else." We looked at each other across his small kitchen, and I felt something shift between us. Some wall coming down, some guard being lowered. "Dinner's ready," he said finally, but his voice was softer now, more intimate somehow. He served pasta with some kind of cream sauce that tasted like herbs and wine and effort. We ate on his balcony, the city lights beginning to twinkle below us as the sun set. The conversation flowed easier now, moving from work to books to travel dreams to childhood stories. I learned that he'd grown up in Oregon, that he'd wanted to be a teacher before life pushed him toward marketing, that he read at least a book a week and had strong opinions about coffee that bordered on snobbery. He learned that I'd never lived anywhere but this city, that I'd studied computer science because I was good at math but had always secretly wanted to write, that I made excellent pancakes but terrible decisions about relationships. "Terrible how?" he asked, refilling our wine glasses as the evening air grew cooler. "I have a habit of choosing people who don't actually want to know me," I said, surprised by my own honesty. "People who like the idea of a quiet, uncomplicated boyfriend but get bored when they realize that's all I am." "That's not all you are." The certainty in his voice caught me off guard. "How do you know?" "Because you're here," he said simply. "Because you noticed I was asking about you. Because you wrote me a note welcoming me to the building even though you thought I was a stranger." "I didn't write you a note." He smiled, reaching into his pocket and pulling out a folded piece of paper. "You left this under my door yesterday morning." I unfolded it, confused, and saw my own handwriting. "Welcome to the building. The coffee shop on the corner is excellent and the Thai place delivers until midnight. 3A." I stared at the note, having no memory of writing it. Then, slowly, the memory came back. Yesterday morning, after I'd watched him leave for work, I'd felt that strange urge to reach out, to make some kind of connection. I'd written the note without really thinking, then apparently delivered it without remembering. "I was half asleep," I said, embarrassed. "I don't even remember." "It was kind," he said. "Thoughtful. It made me think maybe the quiet guy across the hall was someone I'd like to know." We were sitting close enough that I could see the way the evening light caught in his eyes, could smell the faint scent of his cologne mixing with the cooling air. There was something building between us, something that felt both inevitable and terrifying. "David," I started, then stopped, not sure what I wanted to say. "Yeah? Why did you really move back here?" He was quiet for a long moment, looking out at the park where couples walked hand in hand and families played on the grass. Honestly, he said finally, I missed you. The words hit me like a physical blow, unexpected and profound. You missed me, but we barely knew each other. I missed seeing you in the hallways. I missed wondering about you. There was something about the way you'd smile when we passed each other, like you were surprised by your own friendliness. It made me want to know what you were thinking. I felt heat rise in my cheeks. I thought you barely noticed me. I noticed everything, he said quietly. The way you always carried your coffee in the same blue mug. How you'd pause at the mailboxes like you were hoping for something good but not expecting it. The fact that you never seemed to have visitors, but there was music playing in your apartment most evenings. The intimacy of his observations made my chest tight with emotion. He'd been watching me the same way I'd been watching him, collecting small details, building a picture of someone he wanted to understand. I thought I was invisible, I admitted. You were never invisible to me. The words hung between us as darkness settled over the city. The balcony felt smaller somehow, more intimate, like the rest of the world had receded and left just the two of us suspended in this moment. It's getting cold, David said eventually, but neither of us moved to go inside. Instead, he shifted in his chair, turning to face me more directly. Our knees brushed, and neither of us pulled away. Marcus, he said, and my name in his voice still made something flutter in my chest. Can I ask you something? Anything. When you saw me moving in, what did you think? I considered lying, giving some safe answer about being curious about a new neighbor, but something about the evening, about his honesty and the wine and the way he was looking at me made truth feel like the only option. I thought you were beautiful, I said quietly, and I thought I was in trouble. He smiled, really smiled, not the careful expression I'd seen before, but something open and delighted that transformed his entire face. Good trouble or bad trouble? I wasn't sure. I'm still not sure. What would make it good trouble? The question felt loaded, dangerous. We were edging towards something neither of us had explicitly named, circling around the possibility that this dinner, this evening, this thing growing between us might be more than friendship. If you wanted it too, I said, the words barely above a whisper. He leaned forward in his chair, close enough that I could see the individual eyelashes framing his dark eyes, close enough that I could feel the warmth radiating from his skin. I want it too, he said simply. For a moment, we just looked at each other. The city buzzed below us, cars and voices and the distant sound of music from someone's open window, but on the balcony everything was still, suspended, waiting. What happens now? I asked. I don't know, he said. But I know I don't want this evening to end. Neither did I. I wanted to sit here forever, close enough to touch but not quite touching, balanced on the edge of something that felt like it could change everything. But eventually the night air grew too cold to ignore, and we reluctantly moved back inside. David made coffee, excellent coffee as promised, and we settled on his couch, the comfortable distance of the balcony replaced by the electric proximity of shared cushions. Tell me something, he said, curling into the corner of the couch and turning to face me. Something you've never told anyone else. The request should have made me nervous, but instead I felt that same strange courage that had carried me through the evening. I used to write, I said. Stories, mostly. Terrible, dramatic things about people finding each other in impossible circumstances. Used to? I stopped in college, convinced myself it was impractical that I should focus on something more reliable. Do you miss it? The question hit deeper than I expected. Every day. Why did you really stop? I was quiet for a moment, trying to find words for something I'd never articulated before. Because the stories I wanted to tell were about men, I said finally. About men finding each other, falling in love, and I wasn't ready to admit what that meant about me. David's expression softened with understanding. How old were you? 20. Old enough to know better, but too scared to be honest with myself. That's not too scared, he said gently. That's just human. We talked for hours after that, sharing stories and secrets and dreams we'd kept buried. David told me about coming out to his family at 25, about the boyfriend who'd left him for someone more exciting, about his fear that he'd never find someone who wanted the quiet kind of love he had to offer. I told him about my parents who'd stopped asking about my dating life years ago, about the loneliness I'd convinced myself was independence, about the way I'd built walls so carefully that I'd forgotten how to tear them down. "But you're tearing them down now," he said, and there was something almost reverent in his voice. "For me. For us." I corrected, and felt the truth of it settle warm in my chest. It was past midnight when I finally said I should go home. We'd migrated closer together on the couch over the course of the evening, and when I moved to stand up, our faces were close enough that I could count the flecks of gold in his eyes. "Thank you," I said, "for dinner, for all of this. Thank you for saying yes." He walked me to his door, and we stood there for a moment in the soft light of his hallway, neither wanting to be the first to break the spell. "Same time tomorrow?" he asked, and there was hope and uncertainty in equal measure in his voice. "I'd like that." "Good." He smiled, but there was something else in his expression now, something that made my breath catch. "Marcus?" "Yeah?" Instead of answering, he stepped closer, close enough that I could feel his breath on my face, could see the way his eyes had gone soft and dark. "Is this okay?" he whispered. I nodded, not trusting my voice. His hand came up to cup my face, thumb brushing across my cheekbone with infinite gentleness. For a moment, we just stood there, breathing the same air, balanced on the precipice of something that would change everything. Then his lips touched mine. It was soft, careful, questioning. A whisper of contact that somehow contained entire conversations. All the watching and wondering, all the careful distance and growing closeness, all the hope and fear and possibility that had been building between us. When we broke apart, it was only by inches. His forehead rested against mine, and I could feel his smile more than see it. "Good trouble?" he asked. "The best kind," I managed. He kissed me again, still soft but with more certainty this time, and I felt something fundamental shift inside me. Some locked door swinging open, some light flooding into spaces that had been dark for too long. When we finally separated, I felt dizzy, unmoored, like the world had tilted and I was still finding my balance. "Tomorrow," he said, and it sounded like a promise. Tomorrow. I let myself into my apartment and stood with my back against the door, heart pounding, fingers touching my lips where I could still feel the ghost of his kiss. Through the walls, I could hear him moving around his apartment, getting ready for bed. Normal sounds, running water, a door closing, footsteps across the floor. But they felt different now, intimate in a way they'd never been before. I belonged to those sounds now, in some small way, and he belonged to mine. That night, I lay in bed and listened to the buildings settle around us. For the first time in longer than I could remember, the silence didn't feel empty, it felt full of possibility. Part 2. 3 weeks later, I stood at my door, hand raised to knock, when I heard David's voice from the other side. "Just leave it by the door, thanks." But when I opened the door expecting to find a delivery bag, David was standing there instead, hands empty, expression unreadable in the hallway light. "I think we should talk," he said, his voice low, unsure but steady. My heart stuttered against my ribs. 3 weeks of careful dinners, of conversations that danced around the edges of something bigger, of goodnight kisses that left me aching for more. 3 weeks of thinking we were building towards something, only to have him standing at my door looking like he was about to deliver bad news. I opened the door fully, stepping back to let him in. Whatever this was, I was unwilling to pretend there was nothing between us anymore. "Okay," I said, though the word came out rough around the edges. "Let's talk." David stepped into my apartment, and I closed the door behind him, sealing us into the space that had become both sanctuary and prison over the past few years. He looked around with the same careful attention he'd paid to everything since moving back, taking in details I'd stopped noticing, The precisely arranged furniture, the books organized by color rather than content, the complete absence of anything personal or revealing. "You want coffee?" I asked, because I needed something to do with my hands, some ordinary action to counteract the extraordinary feeling that everything was about to change. "No," he said, then reconsidered. "Actually, yes, if you're making some." I moved to the kitchen, grateful for the ritual of measuring grounds and adding water, for the familiar sounds that filled the silence stretching between us. But I could feel David watching me, could sense the weight of whatever he'd come here to say pressing against the careful normalcy of the moment. "Marcus," he said finally, and something in his tone made me turn around. He was standing by my kitchen counter, hands pressed flat against the surface, shoulders tense with whatever internal battle he was fighting. In the warm light of my kitchen, he looked both familiar and strange. This man I'd been learning by degrees, now suddenly unknowable again. "I've felt—" He stopped, shook his head, started over. "Since you moved in, no, since I moved back, I've felt something, something I wasn't expecting." The coffee maker gurgled behind me, filling the silence while I tried to process his words. He was looking at me with an intensity that made my skin feel too tight, like he was trying to read something written in a language he didn't quite understand. "Me too," I said quietly. The admission hung in the air between us, simple and profound. 3 weeks of careful dancing around the truth, and there it was, laid bare in 2 words. David's hands shifted on the counter, fingers spreading wide before curling into loose fists. I keep thinking about that first night, about how easy it felt to talk to you, to be with you. And then I think about how careful we've been since then, how polite. I knew what he meant. After that first kiss, something had shifted between us, not in a bad way, but in a way that made us both more cautious. As if we'd glimpsed something so precious we were afraid to touch it too directly, afraid we might break it with clumsy handling. "I've been scared," I admitted. "Of what?" "Of wanting too much. Of assuming this meant more to you than it does." Something flickered across his face, surprise maybe, or recognition. He pushed away from the counter, taking a step closer to where I stood by the coffee maker. "What if it means everything to me?" he asked. The words hit me like a physical blow, stealing my breath and making my knees feel unsteady. I gripped the edge of the counter behind me, using it as an anchor while the world rearranged itself around this new possibility. "David, I know it's fast," he continued, his voice gaining strength as he spoke. "I know we're still figuring each other out, but I can't keep pretending this is just casual dinners and friendly conversation. Not when I think about you first thing in the morning and last thing at night. Not when I rearrange my schedule just to hear your footsteps in the hallway." He was close enough now that I could see the vulnerability in his eyes, the way his hands trembled slightly at his sides. This wasn't easy for him either. This confession, this laying bare of feelings we'd both been guarding so carefully. "Why now?" I asked. Though what I really meant was, why are you brave enough to say this when I've been too scared to even think it? "Because I couldn't keep pretending I didn't see it in your eyes," he said simply. "Every time you look at me, Marcus, like you're seeing something you want, but don't think you can have." My face burned with embarrassment and recognition. Had I been so transparent? Had every careful glance, every moment of stolen observation been written so clearly across my features? "I watch you too," I said, the words tumbling out before I could stop them. "Through the peephole from my window whenever I hear your door. I know what time you leave for work and what time you come home. I know you listen to classical music when you cook and jazz when you read. I know you don't smile much, but when you do—" "What?" he prompted gently. "When you do, it feels like the room changes, like everything gets brighter and warmer and more possible." The confession left me feeling stripped bare, exposed in a way that was both terrifying and liberating. I'd been carrying these observations, these small intimacies, for weeks now, hoarding them like precious stones. Speaking them aloud made them real in a way that felt dangerous and necessary. David's expression softened, and he reached out slowly, giving me time to pull away if I wanted to. When I didn't move, his hand settled warm against my cheek, thumb brushing across the skin beneath my eye. You see me, he said, wonder in his voice. Really see me, not just the version of myself I present to the world. How could I not? I leaned into his touch without meaning to, my body responding to his warmth before my mind could catch up. You're, you're impossible to ignore. He laughed softly, and the sound was filled with something that might have been relief. I've felt invisible for so long, in my last relationship, at my old job, even with friends sometimes, like I was performing the idea of myself rather than actually being myself. I understood that feeling intimately, the exhaustion of maintaining a persona, of being who others expected rather than who you actually were. You don't have to perform anything with me, I said. I know, that's what scared me. We stood there in my kitchen, his hand on my face, the coffee maker still gurgling behind us, and I felt something fundamental settle into place. Not the desperate, grasping feeling I'd mistaken for love before, but something steadier, more substantial, like coming home to a place I didn't know I'd been searching for. The coffee's ready, I said eventually, though I made no move to pour it. In a minute, David murmured, and then his other hand was on my waist, pulling me closer with gentle pressure. This kiss was different from the careful ones we'd shared before, deeper, more certain, filled with all the words we'd been too scared to say. I felt myself melt into him, all the careful distance I'd been maintaining dissolving like sugar in rain. When we broke apart, we were both breathing hard, foreheads pressed together in the space between one heartbeat and the next. What happens next? He asked, echoing the question from our first evening together. I don't know, I said, echoing my own response, but I don't want this to stop. He smiled then, the kind of smile that did change the room, that made everything feel possible and new. Good, he said, because I don't think I could stop even if I wanted to. We did eventually pour the coffee, carrying our mugs to the living room and settling on my couch, the same couch where I'd spent so many evenings alone, reading or working or simply existing in solitude. But with David beside me, the space felt transformed, less like a hiding place and more like a haven. Can I ask you something? I said, curling one leg beneath me so I could face him properly. Anything. That night you made dinner, you said you'd been wondering about me when you lived here before. What did you wonder? David considered this, absently tracing patterns on his coffee mug with one finger. I wondered if you were lonely. I wondered if you chose to be alone or if it just happened that way. I wondered what you thought about when you stood by your window in the mornings. I thought about escape, I said honestly, about what it would be like to be someone else, somewhere else, someone braver. And now? I looked at him, really looked at him, taking in the way the lamplight caught in his dark hair, the patient attention in his eyes, the careful way he held himself like he was still afraid I might change my mind about all of this. Now I think about what it would be like to stay, I said, to be brave enough to build something instead of always looking for the exit. Something shifted in his expression, and he set down his coffee mug, reaching for my hand instead. His fingers were warm and slightly calloused, real in a way that made my chest tight with emotion. I want to build something with you, he said quietly. I know it's probably too soon to say that, but I can't seem to help myself around you. You make me want things I thought I'd given up on. Like what? Like Sunday mornings that don't feel empty, like someone to call when something good happens at work, like, he paused, color rising in his cheeks, like someone who knows how I take my coffee and remembers to ask about my day. These were small things, ordinary things, but they felt enormous in the context of the careful solitude we'd both been maintaining. The idea of sharing daily rhythms with someone, of being known in all the small, mundane ways that made up a life, it was both thrilling and terrifying. I don't know how to do this, I admitted. The building something part. I'm good at self-sufficiency, not so good at he. Neither am I, David said. But I want to learn, if you want to learn with me. I thought about the past 3 weeks, the way anticipation had replaced routine, how the sound of his footsteps in the hallway had become something I looked forward to rather than just noticed. I thought about the careful consideration he brought to everything, from cooking dinner to choosing words, and how safe that made me feel. I want to learn, I said. He lifted our joined hands to his lips, pressing a soft kiss to my knuckles that made warmth spread through my entire body. So what do we do now? I asked. Do we make rules, set expectations, figure out what this is supposed to look like? David laughed, and the sound was lighter than I'd heard from him before, more carefree. How about we figure it out as we go, make it up as we need to? That sounds terrifying. Yeah, he agreed, but also kind of wonderful. We talked until nearly 2 in the morning, sharing stories and fears and hopes with the kind of raw honesty that only seemed possible in the deep hours of night. David told me about his ex-boyfriend who'd complained that David was too intense, too much, and had left him feeling like his capacity for love was somehow a flaw. I told him about my pattern of choosing people who kept me at arm's length, how I'd convinced myself that distance was safer than disappointment. Maybe we're both too much, David said, his thumb tracing circles on the back of my hand. Maybe that's why this works. Is that what this is? Too much? He considered the question seriously, and I loved that about him, the way he gave weight to things that mattered, even if they seemed small. It feels like exactly enough, he said finally. Like I've been hungry without realizing it, and now I'm finally being fed. The metaphor should have been overwrought, but coming from him, in the soft light of my living room with the city quiet around us, it felt like the most natural thing in the world. I should let you get some sleep, he said eventually, though neither of us moved to end the evening. You could stay, I said, the words slipping out before I could second-guess them. I mean, it's late and you're just across the hall, but… Are you sure? I nodded, suddenly certain in a way I hadn't been about anything in years. I'm sure, he smiled, soft and wondering, like I'd offered him something precious. I'd like that. I gave him a toothbrush and a t-shirt that was too small for me but would probably fit him better. While he got ready for bed, I stood in my bedroom and tried to process what was happening. This morning, I'd been a man who lived alone, who'd built his entire existence around solitude and self-sufficiency. Tonight, I was someone who shared his space, who wanted to wake up next to another person, who was brave enough to want things he'd never thought he could have. When David emerged from the bathroom, hair damp and wearing my shirt, I felt something fundamental click into place. He looked like he belonged here, like my space had been waiting for him to complete it. We settled into bed with the careful politeness of people still learning each other's boundaries. But when I reached to turn off the bedside lamp, David's hand caught mine. Marcus? Yeah? Thank you for letting me stay for all of this. In the darkness, I could just make out the shape of him beside me, could feel the warmth of his body close enough to touch, but not quite touching. Thank you for being brave enough to say something, I whispered back. I don't think I would have been. We got here eventually, he said. That's what matters. I lay awake for a long time after his breathing had evened out into sleep, not from anxiety or restlessness, but from wonder. The weight of him beside me, the sound of another person breathing in my space, the knowledge that when morning came I wouldn't wake up alone, it was almost too much to process. But there was something else too, something settling and right about having him there, like my apartment had been holding its breath for months and could finally exhale. When I did finally drift off, it was to the sound of David's quiet breathing and the distant hum of the city beyond our windows. For the first time in years, falling asleep felt like coming home rather than disappearing from the world. I woke to sunlight streaming through windows I'd forgotten to cover and the sound of someone moving quietly in my kitchen. For a moment, disorientation held me suspended between sleep and waking. This wasn't how mornings usually worked. It wasn't the pattern of solitude I'd grown accustomed to. Then memory flooded back, and with it a warm rush of contentment that felt entirely foreign. David was here. David had spent the night. David was, by the sound of things, making coffee in my kitchen like he belonged there. I found him standing by the counter, still wearing my t-shirt, hair mussed from sleep, holding 2 mugs and looking uncertain about something. I hope you don't mind, he said when he saw me. I couldn't figure out how to work your coffee maker, so I just made it the way I would at home. I don't mind, I said, accepting the mug he offered. The coffee was different from how I usually made it, stronger with some indefinable richness that spoke of better beans and more careful attention. It tasted like mornings that weren't solitary, like someone who cared about the details of comfort. We sat at my small kitchen table, and I tried to adjust to the strangeness of sharing morning space with another person. Not bad strange, just different, like learning a new language or hearing a familiar song in a different key. "Did you sleep okay?" David asked, and there was something tentative in his voice, like he was checking to make sure the previous night hadn't been a mistake. "Better than I have in months," I said truthfully. "You?" "Same." He smiled into his coffee mug. I forgot what it was like to not wake up alone. "How long since you lived with someone?" 2 years, since James and I broke up." His expression darkened slightly at the mention of his ex. "What about you?" "I've never lived with someone," I admitted, expecting to feel embarrassed by this confession. Instead, it just felt like another piece of information, another part of myself I was learning to share. "Not romantically, anyway. I had roommates in college, but that was different." David nodded thoughtfully. "Are you worried about it? About this changing things between us?" The question was fair and necessary, but it surprised me how little anxiety it stirred up. A month ago, the thought of someone staying in my space overnight would have sent me into a spiral of worry about privacy and routine disruption. Now, looking at David across my kitchen table, rumpled and real and somehow essential, I felt only a quiet certainty. "I thought I would be," I said. "But mostly I'm just hoping you'll want to do it again." His smile was radiant, transforming his entire face from cautious to delighted. "I was hoping you'd say that." After breakfast, which David made because he claimed to have actual food in his apartment, as opposed to my collection of cereal and microwave meals, he went across the hall to shower and get ready for work. I watched him go with a strange mix of contentment and anticipation, like I was already looking forward to the moment he'd return. The day passed differently than usual. I worked, but with less focus and more frequent breaks to simply sit and process what had changed. Every sound from across the hall drew my attention. David getting ready for work, leaving for the day, the silence that followed. But it wasn't the hollow silence I was used to. It was expectant silence, pregnant with the knowledge that he'd be back, that this wasn't an ending but an intermission. Around noon, I heard my phone buzz with a text message. "Hope you're having a good day. Can't stop thinking about last night. D." I stared at the message for a long moment, feeling something warm and unfamiliar settle in my chest. When was the last time someone had thought about me during their day? When was the last time I'd mattered enough to someone that they'd interrupt their work just to tell me so? "Me too," I typed back. "Dinner tonight? My turn to cook." "Perfect. See you at 7." I spent the rest of the afternoon planning a menu with the kind of attention I usually reserve for complex coding problems. Nothing too ambitious. I wasn't the cook David was, but something that would show I'd put thought into it, that his comfort mattered to me. By 6:30, I was pacing my apartment, checking and rechecking the simple pasta dish I'd prepared, wondering if the wine I'd bought was the right kind, generally behaving like someone who'd never hosted a dinner before. Which, in many ways, I hadn't. Not like this. Not for someone who mattered. At exactly 7 o'clock, David knocked on my door. When I opened it, he was holding a small bouquet of flowers, nothing elaborate, just some seasonal blooms from the market down the street, and wearing the kind of smile that made my heart do complicated things in my chest. "You didn't have to," I said, accepting the flowers with hands that trembled slightly. "I wanted to," he said simply. "Besides, I figure if we're doing this, really doing this, I want to do it right." Doing this. The phrase sent a thrill through me that was part excitement, part terror. We were really doing this, whatever this was. Building something, creating something together instead of just existing in parallel solitude. Dinner was better than I'd expected. The pasta wasn't overcooked. The sauce had actual flavor. and David's appreciative sound suggested I hadn't completely embarrassed myself. But more than the food, I loved watching him eat it. The way he savored each bite, the small sounds of pleasure he made, the grateful attention he paid to something I'd made for him. "This is really good," he said, and I could tell he wasn't just being polite. "Where did you learn to cook like this?" "YouTube, mostly," I admitted. "I figured if I was going to live alone, I should probably learn to feed myself properly." "Well, you succeeded." He took another bite, thoughtful. "I like cooking for people, but I'd forgotten how nice it is to have someone cook for you." There was something wistful yet